I'm Don Garrett, chair of the philosophy department here at NYU, and it's my happy charge to introduce Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, our last speaker of the day. Walter is Chauncey Stillman Professor of Practical Ethics in the Department of Philosophy and the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, where he's affiliated with the Duke Institute for Brain Sciences, the Duke Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, and the Duke Center for Interdisciplinary Decision Sciences. His recent books are Moral Skepticisms and Morality Without God. That's not just talk on my part. There is a question mark in that title. His current work is on moral psychology and brain science and the uses of neuroscience in the legal system. But his question today is there one moral brain? As someone who's known and admired Walter since our days as graduate students together, I can attest that if there is just one moral brain, it's probably Walter's. If there's more than one, his is one of the best, or maybe more than one of the best. Walter Sinnott-Armstrong.
So it's late. I'm between you and drinks. I don't want to be between you and drinks. So I'm going to try to be very quick here, and I'll do my best. James made it much easier for me to be quick because many of the points that he made are points that I'm going to want to make too. The other prefatory comment I want to make is that for me this is kind of a midlife crisis because I write about morality. Don was saying, moral skepticisms, moral dilemmas, moral this, moral that. Always writing about morality, but I've begun to wonder whether there's anything that I'm talking about, whether there's a coherent field here that ought to be studied as a single entity, whether we might be able to make more progress if we break it into the different components of morality and study them separately. And I mean that as a lesson both for philosophers and also for scientists who are studying it either as psychology or neuroscience, that all of our fields might benefit from the model of memory. So if somebody says, what do you remember? Right? They're not asking what particular things, they're asking what kinds of things do you remember? And the answer will include semantic memory, remembering that certain things are true, episodic memory, remembering being in certain places and having certain experiences. So, for example, I remember being at the very last volleyball game of my daughter's high school volleyball career, and she, at the very last point, served an ace, and I was so proud. And when we got home, I told my wife, and she said, "Darn, I'm only going to have a semantic memory, not an episodic memory." And sure enough, she's only got a semantic memory, not an episodic memory. There's working memory. While you're working on a problem, you've got to keep the different facts straight. There's long-term memory about things that happened years ago. Explicit and implicit memory, conditioning and skills would be examples of implicit memory, where you might not have an actual conscious experience of what you're remembering, but you might remember how to ride a bike without actually being able to explain it to anybody else. You kind of go like that, But that counts as a type of memory. And many people want to say that, well, but all of these are memories of things in the past. I'm not sure that remembering how to ride a bike is remembering something about the past or having information about the past. It's about how to ride a bike. But it's even clearer that you can remember that you have an appointment tomorrow. And that's remembering the future. It's remembering a fact about the future. And you don't remember when you learned it or when somebody told you. You remember that you have an appointment tomorrow. Or you remember that pi is, now I've got to read because I don't remember it, but 3.1415926535897 and so on, right? And some people can remember those digits. Well, they're not remembering the past. They're remembering the future. So when you think through all of these different types of memory, it turns out that memory is not a unified topic. There's not a single thing that is memory. When psychologists and neuroscientists realize that, it liberates them for a certain type of study, a certain type of research, so they can be more detailed about what particular type of memory are you talking about? What particular neural system undergirds that type of memory rather than this type of memory? And a lot more progress was made in the study of memory because they recognized that memory was not a single thing to be studied. Okay? So that's what I think we ought to do with morality. Okay? Now, John Haidt, who's down here, has said something like this many times. And building on Schrader and others, Haidt has argued that we have harm. We have 5 foundations, according to Haidt: harm, care, fairness, reciprocity, in-group loyalty, authority, respect, and purity and sanctity. And honestly, even that's not fine-grained enough, John. You got to go beyond that. I mean, look at this. Distributive justice here, but then there's retributive justice about punishing unfairly, and there's fair trials and fair methods of decision-making. Democracy's right because people ought to vote, not hereditary monarchy. That's very different. That's not distributive necessarily, or retributive is procedural justice. And you can, of course, separate killing, disabling, causing pain, disappointing. I always wonder, when I give a boring lecture, am I causing harm to my students? Right? Does boredom count as a type of pain or harm? And all of these others can be subdivided as well, such as not committing cannibalism is a certain type of pathogen disgust, induces a certain type of pathogen disgust, whereas sexual disgust might be a very different kind of thing. So you can subdivide, even further. Now, John's got his reasons for grouping these together statistically in a certain way, but I would say maybe we need to break them up. We also need to add to them, okay? Honesty's not on the list. That always surprised me. Lying, breaking promises, cheating, those are paradigm cases of immorality, but it's not clear exactly where they fit in the 5 foundations. What about the moral virtue of courage? I mean, that was a big one on Aristotle's list, and in many cultures that's viewed as morally central. And yet, again, it seems to be a very different kind of thing from the ones we've talked about so far. And then we get to the 7 deadly sins, pride versus modesty. Modesty is viewed in many cultures as a moral virtue, not just a self-interested or prudential virtue, not just an aesthetic virtue, not even a religious virtue. It's viewed as a moral virtue in some sense of moral. Okay? Moderation, gluttony. We say, gluttony was like a deadly sin? How sad in the Middle Ages, I like to go out for an all-you-can-eat buffet, and I would be in trouble. So industry and sloth. Sloth is bad, industry is good. And the Protestant work ethic, for many people, is a moral ethic. And you should not show sloth, you should show industry instead. Again, different cultures are including different things within the ambit of morality. And then it becomes very difficult to say what it is that makes all of these moral in their view or in reality or in your view. And so you can react to this diversity in a number of different ways. Okay? The question is, how radical are you? Right? You can be a moderate and say, okay, fine, Walter, no big deal, right? Fine, John, no big deal. Morality includes sub-areas, sure, and those sub-areas do differ in important ways, but there's still something that unifies those sub-areas that makes them all moral judgments, or all areas of the same thing. Like people who said of memory, well, there's something that makes them all memory, right? And that's that they're all about the past. It didn't work for memory, but maybe it's going to work for morality. And then there's going to be the radical view, which is my view, which is these sub-areas share nothing at all that makes them moral and distinguishes them from other areas. To get a feature that unifies this category, you need something that's common to all of the different areas of morality, or all the different types of moral judgment, and something that distinguishes those moral judgments from all the judgments that you want to say are non-moral judgments. Okay? Now, I should say there are, I think this slide got dropped somehow. So we'll have to ask John what his view is, and we'll have to ask Leanne what her view is. But at least on a recent paper by Gray, Young, and Waits, is it Waits or Whites? Waits. They argue that, in fact, morality is unified because it's always about an intending agent causing a certain type of harm or suffering. And the answer is, well, let's look back at the cases. Does gluttony, sloth, are those going to fit into that? What about cannibalism and incest? I mean, if it's cannibalism, it's not clear that there's somebody that's getting harmed. But even in more paradigm cases like breaking promises when the person forgot that you promised, or maybe they're dead, there's going to be no suffering or bad experience that they suffer as a result of your breaking the promise. But many people are going to say it's wrong anyway. Is there always an intending agent, or even a knowing agent? No, because many people would say negligence can be morally wrong. You can, by mistake, because you were careless, cause a harm. Maybe that's less morally wrong, but it's still morally wrong. And so it seems to me if you focus on the content in that way, it's going to be very hard to argue that all of the different things I listed are going to count within morality. And you might go functional. You might say, well, there has to be a particular function of moral judgments, and all of those different judgments are sharing that function. And I had it on the slide, but I lost the slide. I think it was something about overcoming egoism and egoistic concerns. But if you think through those cases, it's not always overcoming egoistic concerns. Sometimes, like with sloth, it might be, well, you're trying to improve your own life, or gluttony. Or many of those are not having to do with overcoming your egoistic tendencies. It's actually, they're furthering your own tendency, your own desire to improve your own life. Okay? They're what many people would say prudence, and then they would say, and it's not morality. But these groups of people are saying, well, it's still morality, even though it's prudence. In order to be unified, a certain kind has to have a common and distinctive feature that enables significant generalizations. My model for this is water is H2O. Because I always wondered, why is it H2O? And it doesn't depend what isotope it is. Is heavy water water? And the answer is, yes, it is water. But why? The reason is that the difference between heavy water and regular water is just the neutrons. And the neutrons don't affect the chemical bonds. In general, there are minor effects in special circumstances, but in general, and at the time water was getting defined, they didn't know about the effect on the chemical bonds. So they thought, well, if I define water as simply H2O, regardless of which isotope of hydrogen is or which isotope of oxygen it is, I'm going to be able to make significant generalizations about how water bonds and reacts to other chemicals. Okay? And those generalizations are enabled by defining water as H2O independent of isotope. If there were no generalizations that could usefully be made at that level of generality, then water would not have been defined that way. Because you want to capture a definition that gives you significant generalizations for the purpose of your theory. Okay? And that, I take it, is what we want for morality or moral judgments as well. Let me clarify that we're talking here about moral judgments as opposed to aesthetic judgments or religious judgments or economic judgments or legal judgments. We're not talking about moral judgments as opposed to immoral judgments, and we're not talking about moral judgments that we believe in as opposed to moral judgments we don't believe in. So a Nazi who says, it's morally right to kill this group of people, we disagree with them. We still think that's moral. That's a moral judgment. It's not a moral thing to do. Maybe immoral that they have that moral judgment, but they're not saying it's a beautiful thing. They're not saying it's economic. They're not saying it's legal. They're saying it's morally good, even though it's a despicable view to hold. So I wanted to clarify that. Now, my argument is basically that no feature unifies all and only moral judgments. There's just none. How are you going to prove that? Oh no, I was told when I was a grad student of philosophy, never try to prove a negative existential, right? Because you can't prove there's nothing of that sort. And sure enough, it's very hard. So what can you do? You can basically look at the main candidates for this role in defining morality, look at them one by one, and try to argue against them. So I think morality is not unified by, I'm wanted to mention, I'm not going to go through all of these today. I'm going to focus on the brain. But the content of morality, here's we have Gray and Young and Waits. The function of morality, the force of morality, the form of morality, the phenomenology. I'm not going to go through all that because we don't have time. Oh, so I do have, here are the quotations. I just was ahead of myself here. So there's the Young quotation, right? All moral judgments can be explained, notice all moral judgments can be explained by appealing to a dyadic template, two perceived minds, moral agent characterized by agency, moral patient characterized by experience. I already gave my problematic examples for that regarding deathbed promises, forgotten promises, and so on. Okay? And then here's the quotation from John. Moral systems are interlocking sets of values, norms, practices, and so on, that work together to suppress or regulate self-interest and make cooperative societies possible. Okay? They might improve cooperative societies. I don't know that they make them possible. They don't even always regulate self-interest because sometimes they promote self-interest by making that person's life better, such as in the case of industry. Okay. But what I want to focus on is the last possibility, because it takes too long to go through all of them at once. The last possibility is maybe there's a unified brain mechanism that is common and peculiar to all moral judgments. So I want to look at some of the variations in brain mechanism that occur when you look at the different areas of moral judgment. If there is a single brain area tied to all the different types of moral judgments, then morality would be unified in a way that would be significant. It would, for example, support significant generalizations about how moral judgments would be affected if that brain area were injured. Right? So if there's a brain mechanism that's associated with all these different types, we would have a unity of the kind that I'm claiming there is none. But I don't think that's going to work. Now, it's always difficult to say that there is none, as I said, because maybe we just haven't found it yet. Maybe it's somewhere in a part of the brain we haven't been looking. Maybe other tests will reveal it. So all you can do to argue for a thesis like this is to display the variety and say, go ahead, show me, right? I'm not from Missouri, but I've always thought, yeah, that's like, that's what you ought to show me. So first, let's look at positive versus negative. Ideals versus, maybe a better word there would be prohibitions. There can be moral judgments that say, that's a really good thing to do, but you're not required to do it, and not doing it is not prohibited. It's okay either way, but it's good, such as giving to charity. So what Mull and his group did was they set up different types of charities. This one, the example here is Death with Dignity, which enables euthanasia for the terminally ill. The nice thing is you pick charities like that are going to be morally questionable. Some people are going to say, that's horrible, right? And other people are going to say, that's worth giving to. You give each subject $128 at the start of the experiment, and if they give away none of it, they actually walk out of the experiment with $128. But they're given the option of giving the money to these various charities. Okay? By the way, every subject in their experiment gave away some of their money to charities. And the average amount given away was 40%. So they're actually giving away quite a bit. You're given these options then. You can, for example, if you say, well, So if you give to this charity, if you say yes, you lose $0 and get $0. The organization gets $5. So that's a non-costly donation. It doesn't cost you anything to give the organization $5. Notice down here, you can say, well, suppose you get this purple box, you get negative $2. You're down from 128 to 126, and the organization gets 5. Now, if you say yes, you're donating, right? And it's costly to you. They get 5, you lose 2. But notice up here, you get 2 and the organization gets 5. Sometimes you said no. For example, if you think euthanasia is immoral, you might say no to that. I'm not going to take a $2 gain in order to give $5 to that charity, because then I will be contributing to something that I take to be immoral. So you can manipulate the payoffs so as to make it either costly or not costly, and the subjects will sometimes oppose the donation and sometimes accept the donation, and sometimes make the donation. Okay? And what they found was that for the donations, presumably they thought that charity's a good thing, and they were getting activity in the ventral tegmental area, the subgenual area. We don't have to go into great detail here for lack of time, but when you got to non-costly opposition, they were getting lateral orbital frontal cortex, anterior prefrontal cortex, totally different areas for the judgments, where they're making a negative moral judgment, and that's why they're willing to accept a loss in order to stop that charity from getting a contribution. Then the areas that were activated when they were giving money to the charity in order to promote something that they thought was morally good, thus suggesting that the areas of activation of the brain that are tied to ideals as opposed to prohibitions are very different. Okay? So that's the first one. Now some people react and go, yeah, okay, that's not so surprising, right? Most people who write on this topic think about incest and killing. It's all this negative stuff. They don't think about giving to charity and, you know, the positive stuff as much. And so maybe it's not surprising that the positive ideals are connected to different brain areas than the negative prohibitions. But that's not where it stops, of course. We also want to look at the different areas of negative morality. Here we have harming people, being dishonest, and looking at impurity. We've already seen the examples of that in previous talks, so I'll skip over that. We studied this with a group from Princeton and Dartmouth, and what we did is we spent a long time getting 14 examples of harmful scenarios that are not dishonest and not disgusting, 14 that are dishonest but not harmful or disgusting, and 14 that are disgusting but neither dishonest nor harmful, and 14 that were neutral but none of the other three. Okay? So you got to get good separation, but we also wanted each scenario type to have at least 30% of the pilot subjects saying that it's wrong and at least 30% of the pilot subjects saying it was not wrong, so that we can compare the people who said it was wrong to the people who said it was not wrong. Okay? Because it might be that there's something common that drives the wrongness judgment, even if the processing of the different scenarios is different. So there we go. We've got over 80%, over 20. I just said that, and we also looked at affect and asked them about their affect. So basically, they stare across for a little while. Then they read a scenario. This one says, while paying for groceries, Andrew forgets to remove the package of meat from the bottom when he's out in the parking lot. He remembers, but he doesn't go back in to pay. Is it morally wrong for him to keep the meat without paying? And then how confident are you? We also got confidence ratings. Okay. The results are pretty straightforward, although complex. In the harmful scenarios, we were getting superior temporal sulcus, anterior cingulate, supplementary motor. You can look at, the brain scientists out there can look. What the non-brain scientists should be doing is just saying, Well, oh, this, by the way, is comparing the people who judged it wrong within that scenario type to the people in the judging neutral scenarios where they said it was not wrong. Because in those scenarios, they basically said none of them were wrong because there was no basis for saying so. Notice that there's very little overlap in the areas, right? Amygdala, temporal pole, not over here, temporal parietal junction, not over there, not over there. There's this one area, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which has been discussed before today. And so we looked at that more carefully with the conjunction analysis. Now, what we found with the conjunction analysis was actually a separate area of the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex that didn't overlap with the other areas. But regardless, there was something that came out that was shared by all of the different scenario types. The problem is that's common, but it's not distinctive because that area has been associated with lots of other things. In particular, thinking about other people, which our scenarios did, but more importantly, ambiguity. Remember, we set up our scenarios so at least 30% thought it was wrong, at least 30% thought it was not wrong, so they were all intentionally ambiguous in that sense. And this area of activation might be a reaction to the ambiguity because it's been shown that it also gets activated by ambiguity in other areas that are non-moral. Okay? The next area, justice, right? We want to talk about justice. How long have I been going? I haven't even been. Plenty of time. Plenty of time. Good.
25 minutes.
Okay. Distributive justice. Okay? Was studied by Meng Xu, who did a wonderful design. I thought, what was interesting about this design, I think I'm just going to, I'll tell you about it here, and then I'll tell you the source of it. He took actual orphans in Uganda and allotted each of them 24 meals, right? And then the subjects got to take meals away from these starving orphans in Uganda. And they were really taking meals away from the starving orphans in Uganda. It was actually a lot of them. No orphan ended up with fewer meals than at the beginning, but there were actual effects. There was no deception. That's what you were really doing in this study. And so what they did is, well, here, I'll just switch to the design here. What happened was he wanted to get an analog of the trolley problem, was what he was going for. So there's this trolley kind of starting here, this little red ball, and it moves across the screen, goes through this little hole here, and you can move this. This is the switch. You can go one way or the other. And if it's this direction, it bounces off and goes up and hits these guys. If it's the other direction, like that direction, it bounces off and goes down and hits that one guy. So it's always 2 against 1 in the scenario. And it's just like a trolley, like which track are you going to go on? This is called the display period. This is called the switch period. You can only move this thing during that period, and the red ball is moving fairly slowly across, so you have plenty of time. And then the hit period is when it hits one of the others, and that's when the meals are taken away. What's cool about this design is you can vary 2 factors, efficiency and equity. Because notice in this particular scenario, Dick and Enoch, if you hit them, they lose 13 meals and 5 meals, right? But at least there are 2 people that are losing. There's less inequity by his measure in that particular payoff. But there's also less efficiency because you're taking 18 total meals away instead of 15. So somebody who's really into efficiency, let's get the most meals we can to the starving orphans, is going to go with, the lowest number of meals lost, and they're going to be over here. But somebody who's into equity, this might not be the best example, but imagine it says, like 9 and 9 there. Then there would be a lot of equity over here, but still not as efficient as that side. So what he's looking at is the brain areas that are activated when people are considering these different factors and actually making decisions, in this case, not just judgments, but actual decisions about which orphans to take meals away from. So the results are that during the display period, remember that initial point before the ball goes through the little slot, he got activity in the putamen. And that was associated with efficiency, but not with equity. Okay? Then during the display period and the switch period, which was when you were deciding whether to move the little lever there, you got bilateral activity in the insula, but that was correlated with equity and not with efficiency. Did get, during the hit period, activity in the caudate that was correlated with both. But notice during the hit period, you've already made your judgment because you've already moved the thing. It's going one way or the other. And then the ball hits that person. But that's more a reaction to the result of your action, not to your action itself, and probably not to the judgment. Okay? And individuals with higher activity in the insula and the caudate were more likely to reject inequitable allocation. So he could actually look at the data. Well, I'll show you the slide on that. So the putamen is associated with efficiency during the display period. The insula is associated with equity during both the display and the switch period. The caudate is associated with equity and efficiency during the hit period. And this is the slide I wanted to get to. You can actually predict people's moral judgments just by looking at their brain data without knowing what they actually did and get it right significantly, statistically significantly higher percentage of the time than chance. Not a great percentage, don't get me wrong, but one of the first times that people have been able to do that. So you're able to predict people's moral judgments from their brain activity alone. But the real payoff for my story is that you've got different areas of the brain associated with different moral factors. When you make a judgment on the basis of equity, which looks like one part of the brain is going. When you have a judgment on the basis of efficiency, you've got another judgment, another area of the brain going. They're both moral judgments, but it doesn't look like there's any brain area that's associated with both kinds of moral judgments that's going to predict for both groups of people. Okay? And that's just distributive justice. Now we've got retributive justice. You know, they're both called justice, but why? Because Aristotle called them that, right? Which is not a great source of, insight for science, I don't think. So you want to look at retributive justice. This is a study by Robinson. Kurzban is where this particular study I'm going to talk about is done by Buchholz and al. But they use these scenarios, among others. Notice that you've got short-change cheat. The cab driver basically cheats the passenger out of $20. Stealing a clock radio from the car, okay, sneaks into the back of the car, takes the clock radio. And here, go into the person's house and into the garage and steals an electric drill, okay? And what they did is they took 24 scenarios like this. Here are some more. And had people rank them in the order of which actions deserve more punishment. It's important that they're making a moral judgment. The question was not which actions will receive more punishment in your legal system. The question was the moral question, which actions deserve more punishment. Okay? So they're actually making moral judgments of retributive justice in these scenarios. And it might look like, those are actually not that far apart. People are going to disagree about those. But actually, you get very high levels of agreement. Actually, I'll go to the next slide here. Notice what's happening is you can look here, and there are a bunch of people. This shows how many people put it in the wrong place. Like, how many people put this one, which is S23, into the 22nd place? Only 2. Right? So those they're missing by 1 rank, right? Those they're missing by 2 ranks. But generally, when you get more than 2 or 3 off, there's almost nobody that's ranking these things way off from what the mean was for the entire group. So if you look at pairwise comparisons, there was agreement within the group 96% of the time. So they're having very high agreement in fairly close scenarios. And what Buchholz et al. Did is they went and took those scenarios and a bunch of others, modified them somewhat, and put subjects in an fMRI thinking about them. What they found was that there's a relationship between responsibility assessments, that is, how responsible is the person, which was correlated with, which was connected to whether or not they should be punished. Okay? And that judgment was separated in this study from how much should they be punished. And the question of whether or not they should be punished, you can see the red line is showing a significant difference in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Okay? So you've got brain activity associated with that particular judgment of retributive justice, whether or not to punish. Then, we look at how much to punish, the punishment rating. They ask them, well, how much punishment should there be on a scale of 1 to 10? And they asked later, I won't go into details, but they asked later about what exactly did you mean by a 3, and there was actually pretty high agreement. But what they found was amygdala. Amygdala was driving, or you can't make causal claims, it was correlated with judgments of how much to punish, whereas it was the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that was correlated with whether or not to punish. And notice that neither of those areas was tied to the areas that we saw in distributive justice. So it's not just that distributive justice is different from retributive justice, it's that within retributive justice, whether or not to punish is using a different neural system than how much to punish. Okay? So, you might say, well, but all the information comes together in this one area in the front, and that's what brings it all together. But of course, that area is also going to bring together information for lots of non-moral decisions, you know, like what kind of car to buy, or you know, where to live, or who to get married to. If that's a general switch for bringing together information from a number of sources, it's not going to be distinctive of moral judgment. So, with some other qualifications that I would have to go through if I had more time, I want to conclude that there's no brain mechanism that's common to all moral judgments and also distinctive of all moral judgments. Right? There's some that are common to all moral judgments. There's some that are distinctive, maybe, that only occur in moral judgments, but they're not covering the range of the different varieties of moral judgments. And so you don't get anything like water, where there's always 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, you know, that's unifying that as a chemical that makes possible generalizations, significant generalizations. Of course, it might be unified at some other level that we haven't talked about. I've only hand-waved and given a few examples for some of these, and if I had another hour, I would go through them all more carefully for you. But I'm just going to assert, and you can question me if you want, that morality is not unified at any of these levels. Okay, so it's like memory. It's like memory that we say we remember these different things. Remember how to ride a bike. Remember seeing my daughter serve that last serve in her high school career. Remember that Lincoln was born in, oh gosh, I always get this confused, 1809 or 1806? I can't remember. Anybody know? 9. There you go. We have 9. Okay. 1809. Thanks to Alvin Goldman for that, in his article on causal theories on it. But, so 1809. Memory is not unified. As a result, we should not be studying memory as a single unified topic within psychology or neuroscience, or philosophy for that matter, because it's going to vary in ways that are going to be important to all those fields. So, 3 quick lessons, and then I'll let you have your drink. What do we learn from the fact that morality is not unified? So what? You can put it really dramatically. There's no such thing as morality. That doesn't mean nothing's wrong. That means there's nothing that distinguishes this wrong from that wrong, you know, that makes this one a moral wrong and that one a non-moral wrong. They can still both be wrong. Okay? So what is the lesson for substantive moral theory? Well, it does not imply that there's no single theory that picks out the true moral judgments and distinguishes them from the false moral judgments. Consequentialism still might be true. It's just that consequentialism also applies to whether you ought to brush your teeth. Right? You ought to brush your teeth if it maximizes utility to brush your teeth. But that doesn't mean you have to think it's immoral not to brush your teeth. It's just kind of nasty. Right? So what theory would be in trouble? And the answer, I think, is Kant. I mean, Kant, in my view, is already in enough trouble. He doesn't need that. But it's also, when you look at Kant's foundations of the metaphysics of morals, he says, I'm going to derive my categorical imperative from the common notion of morality, from common sense view of morality. Well, if there is no unified common sense view of morality, common shared view of morality, then you're not going to be able to derive that. And just as further evidence that he actually thinks morality is unified, he says what unifies morality is all and only categorical imperatives, right? And he says categorical imperatives are moral imperatives. Like, that's just by definition, all and only. Well, that theory begins to fall apart, I think, if you take seriously the lesson that morality is not unified in the way I've been arguing. What about clinical psychology? Well, here James has already beat me to the punch here, because, as he pointed out, deficiencies in one area of moral judgment or morality don't ensure deficiencies in other areas. And psychopaths on impurity and justice, thank you very much for supporting my claim. And this can affect treatment, right? Because you might want to treat people differently if they're deficient in one area rather than another, especially if you're using pharmacological treatments or neurostimulation treatments, but also if you're just using cognitive behavioral therapy treatments, if you don't get straight the difference between psychopaths and know enough about their neural deficits and know that those are different from antisocial personality disorder without the callous and unemotional traits, then you're going to mess up the treatment and not only not be effective, but probably be counterproductive in the treatment. So recognizing the unity of morality and stop asking, are psychopaths, do they make moral judgments? Well, of course they make moral judgments in some areas, but not others, right? You got to ask which area, not do they make them in general. And finally, for experimental moral psychology and neuroscience, I should have added moral neuroscience, the lesson there is a methodological point about how we ought to be doing our studies. We shouldn't be lumping different kinds of moral judgments together, because if we do, we're going to miss the significant differences. If one group out of that class that we use gets swamped by all the others, we're not going to find, we're going to have a false negative, right? On the other hand, if we have a group of judgments and enough of them are similar in a certain respect, we're going to say, well, all of those judgments are like that, when actually it's only a subset of them. So it seems to me that the right way to do these studies is to test as small a class of judgments as we possibly can without boring the hell out of our subjects. Because you want to do it all in the first person as opposed to the second person or the third person. You want to look at not just justice, certainly not morality, but not even just justice, but retributive justice or distributive justice. And distributive justice in goods or benefits versus harms or pains, right? And then look for similarities there. Notice if you do that over a wide enough group, you can always do a conjunctive analysis and look for what's common. So you haven't lost anything. And you might have gained a lot more fine-grained understanding of the neural and psychological basis of these judgments. Of course, we still might eventually find a feature that unifies all morality. I've just given you some reason to doubt it. My main claim is that we've had 10 years of moral neuroscience since the first paper, or 11 actually, since the first papers came out in 2001. So if I were asked, what should we be doing for the next 10 years, the answer is we should be looking at these more fine-grained classes of moral judgments so as to determine how the different classes distinguish from each other, how they are distinguished from other types of judgments and other types of scenarios, in order to get the more fine-grained understanding of the particular subclasses and give up the idea that we're ever going to find out what the neural basis of moral judgments is, because there is no single neural basis of moral judgments. Thanks.
Okay, so do you have any questions? That is the question.
Yeah. was very, very interesting. And I've recently read the following hypothesis for functional unification of morality, that all moral judgments have somehow to do with solving problems of cooperation in human groups. So in the ancestral environment, there were our ancestors that could form groups, and if they formed groups, they could do more things than being alone and could gather more goods and so on and so forth. What do you think about this?
I think it's both too broad and also too narrow. It's too narrow because there's some moral judgments that don't involve cooperation. I mean, you've got to remember, throughout much of history, people thought that if you masturbated, you went to hell because what you did was immoral. And it's not clear what that has to do with cooperation, right? On the other hand, the other direction, there are lots of things about social cooperation that are not viewed as immoral by many of the people that still view them. For example, aesthetic norms about dancing. That's cooperating with people. And they might even be important to the community, in certain ways, because knowing how to dance can be a signal of your membership in the group. But that doesn't mean that all of a sudden you think it's immoral to trip over somebody's feet, right? You think it's aesthetically bad. And so there can be cooperative norms that hold a group together that still the group doesn't view as moral norms. And there can be moral norms, such as masturbation, that don't have anything to do with holding the group together for cooperation.
I hear you suggesting, and it feels right to me, that
Good.
There
That's
is
the start. All of this stuff about morality is just feeling, right? Josh, right, John? Okay, good.
is that there is a weak linkage between the motivation to pro-social behavior and judgment of others. On the other hand, I remember pointing out this study of when people who are voted to cooperate quickly stop cooperating, and so you add a little punishment in there, and the level of cooperation quickly upturns. And so for me, I'm wondering, can we get at what's driving that process, which does in fact connect the two of this kind of judgment, or maybe it isn't a judgment, what's going on to motivate people to add the punishment to get the cooperation. So it seems like there's more going on there than first meets the eye.
I think it's extremely interesting to study punishment and the way it affects behavior. I'm not sure that that can be used to define morality, because I used to, when my kids finished breakfast and they wanted to go play with their friends, I would say, I'm not going to drive you there till you brush your teeth. Right? Now, in a sense, it's a punishment, but it's not because I think they're doing anything immoral. It's kind of, I want them to brush their teeth. Right? And so you can apply punishments to affect behavior in many cases without having to think that the behavior you're punishing was an immoral behavior. The second question you asked is about the motivation to punish. And I'll mention this because I was thinking of this in one of the earlier talks. There's this tendency to want to, this was in James's talk, where you could pay up to 3 and you would take 7 away from somebody who had cheated for each dollar that you paid, and people were typically giving much. But Rob Kurzban did a wonderful variation on that. In his case, it was 5 up to 7, and you got 3 off for each one you donated. And for people who did that in public, the average was 5 out of 7. Okay? For people who did that in private, where even the experimenter did not know who was giving what, but he could still calculate the averages, the mean or average was 1. So if that's the case, then what that means is part of what's motivating people to punish in scenarios that are typically viewed as wrong is making a statement to other people. I'm the kind of guy who's willing to spend my bucks to stand up for morality, right? And, that will get you esteem of your colleagues. That'll get you married to the right mate that you want. That will get you all kinds of things in life But if Kurzban's study is right, and if it generalizes, then that's at least part of the motivation for punishment, is to establish, your status in the community as somebody who's willing to sacrifice in order to stand up for norms that are shared in the community.
Yeah, that was the line here, and then we'll come over to this line.
So if if Kant's moral theory is in trouble, then so is consequentialism, because consequentialism consists of a categorical imperative, just a different one than Kant's. So if categoricity is the problem, then
No, but categoricity is not the problem. The problem is
derived from a
identifying
unified concept, but there's
It's identifying moral concepts with categorical.
Okay, that's fine. So they
Consequentialists don't have to do that.
sure. Well, fair enough. And consequentialism is just a theory, and it covers partial. Moral.
Exactly. So they don't need to have any line between moral and non-moral.
Okay, fair enough. That's a weird form of consequentialism, since using consequentialism is put as a theory of right action. But
right is right. The right answer is on math tests. Right is not a moral term.
fair enough. So the question I had actually is sort of like inside baseball philosophy stuff we're just bringing up, is that I want to get clear on your thesis, which is that at first when I was hearing you, I thought you were saying something along the lines of that the word moral is like the word bank. There's banks and there's banks, and they're really, really different. One's a place you put money in, the other place is like, the side of a river. There's moral and there's moral. There's that and there's that. But it actually sounds like, no. What you really were doing was saying something, in the end, what it sounded like to me when you were making a prescription for people to do empirical work, it sounded like what you're doing is saying, hey, pay more attention to all these distinctions that moral philosophers and political philosophers have been laboring to make for centuries now. There's a difference between retributive justice and distributive justice. There's a difference between these different kinds of norms. As someone who does moral and political philosophy, I have no stake in whether or not I call them moral or not. That never even occurred to me that concept is important. So I just wonder if whether or not the message of your talk is not necessarily a critique of philosophy. It was actually a recommendation, and a very friendly one, it strikes me, to the folks who are doing the research that's being presented here today. Hey, look, there's actually an incredibly rich philosophical tradition of distinctions, and we should probably pay attention to them. And maybe some of the psychological work would pay great dividends if we did our research along the lines of some of the distinctions that philosophers have made.
Look, I'm more than happy to be friendly to philosophy and to tell all the psychologists and neuroscientists you ought to pay attention to the distinctions that philosophers have drawn. But I also want to be friendly to the psychology and neuroscience and say you ought to pay attention to all the distinctions that psychologists have drawn, because some psychologists have been drawing those distinctions as well. What bothers me is when the psychologists study a particular type of moral judgment and they go, now I've learned something about morality. And the answer is no, you haven't. That's like saying, you've been to Florida, so you know the U.S. No, you've only seen one corner, right? And the same for philosophers. And philosophers do the same thing. They go, I'm going to show you something about morality. Here are 2 examples, right? 3 examples. And then they say, now my moral theory is based on that. And this is a theory of morality. So R.M. Hare, for example, says, I've got a theory of moral thinking. He says, no, you don't. You've got a theory of some types of moral thinking. So I think there's plenty of problems on both sides, and we ought to learn from each other.
First, a comment. I'm not sure we all agree what things are in the moral domain and not. We can sort of agree, but for me, the purity question is outside of the domain of morality. But everyone's been, many people deal with it as a moral issue. Just doesn't seem like one to me. Things like patriotism. I don't feel it as a moral dimension that people do.
Go ahead, John. So you can take this one. I bet you're going to vote for Obama.
So the question is, do you find neuroeconomics and motivation and values perhaps a dimension to look at to find unifying principles of morality? We could be motivated to eat, solve, or we could be motivated for cooperation and social good.
I'm not sure what's the question. Neuroeconomics very interesting about decision-making and
right. So
but that's not about morality.
Every decision is about attaining a goal, which is about, and you have a number of values. You want better food, you want warmth, you want this, and you want social cooperation. And you rate those things, you make a decision. Is there a value system, or a few value systems, which are specific to moral choices?
Are Are there any values that are specific?
Well, can we use the framework of neuroeconomics to look at moral decision making?
Sure. I'm not sure that it's going to be a complete theory because it's going to depend on the neuroeconomics as well. I mean, neuroeconomics, I think, also often takes a small sample of examples and then generalizes to all decision making. So I don't want to endorse kind of neuroeconomics as it stands today as a general theory of moral decision making. There are interesting features of, that many moral decisions include that I think that are missed by current neuroeconomics, but they're going to capture some of them. So I don't know how to answer the question in general. Neuroeconomic studies of decision making are going to be relevant to some and are going to decisions within morality, just like they're relevant to some, but not all, decisions outside morality.
I've gotten word we have 2 more questions. Looks like maybe 3 people in line. No. So, oh, okay. They're just especially on 6. Okay, so 2 more questions.
I'm interpreting your talk as a more scientifically informed version of old claims about value pluralism or moral pluralism. And since I'm inclined to accept those claims, I'm also inclined to accept yours. But I have a question about your recommendation that we study narrower and narrower domains of morality, or within morality, because it steers us away from the problems that I guess I'm most interested in within moral theory, which have, and I know you've done a lot of work on this too, which are moral dilemmas or conflicts. And often, not always, but often those conflicts are conflicts between values from different domains. So I wonder if you have anything to say about that. It's not a very specific question, but about if we're studying not one thing when we look at morality, do we have anything left to say about conflicts of values, particularly if they are genuine dilemmas in the sense that there is unavoidable moral wrongdoing in those cases?
I think sometimes what we have to say is there's no answer to that dilemma. Neither value overrides the other. And so that in a sense, they're both right, because neither one is overridden. And in a sense, neither one's right, because neither one of them is overriding. And I mean, that's the analysis I gave in my book on moral dilemmas. Notice that to say that is perfectly compatible with saying there's no particular class of dilemmas that are the moral dilemmas as opposed to the non-moral dilemmas. So the line between the moral ones and the non-moral ones doesn't play any role in that analysis. You can have multiple different values without having to decide which of those values are moral values. So just to comment on the pluralism, I mean, in a sense, you know, I'd be happy with a more empirically informed version of value pluralism, but I take it it's more than that, because some people who are value pluralists, Ross, for example, he says, well, there's 7 prima facie duties, but these are the prima facie duties that are the moral duties, right? And so you can be a pluralist, but still think there's something that unifies this plurality into the moral group and distinguishes it from the non-moral group. So I want to be the radical version that says, not only is there plurality, there's no line between the ones that are moral and non-moral.
Okay, this will be the last question.
Okay, so I wanted to suggest a unified account of everything that was moral. I wanted to suggest that all moral judgments are judgments about reasons, and all true moral judgments are ones that give agents real normative reasons. So note that tells us about various ought claims, so that tells us why you ought not to kill is different from there are lights in this room. And note that it also gives you a distinction between moral normative claims and non-moral normative claims. So there are some funny laws, right? Maybe in bad dictatorships there's a law you ought not to read certain books, but you might not think that gives you real reasons not to read those books. But you might think of all moral claims, they always will give you reasons of that kind. Yes, that was what I was going to ask. And I was thinking also that might put a foot for where, I mean, I'm no Kant advocate, but it looks like the form of Kant's categorical imperative is going to support something along those lines. Namely that you're going to have those reasons independent of what your personal motivations are going to be. Right? It's kind of about what reasons there actually are, normative reasons, rather than how you may be motivated or something along those lines.
So I guess I'm confused, because if the claim is that all claims about normative reasons are, by virtue of that, moral, then it seems to me even hypothetical reasons are going to be normative. They're not neutral. Unless by normative you have something that I need to have explained to me. Because there are all kinds of reasons. There are reasons to believe things. There are, reasons to want things, right? Even if, you don't have any control.
So what was just doing additional work was the truth maker claim, right? So all true moral judgments are always going to give you sort of substantive normative reasons, whereas all these other ones, the epistemic ones, might not work in that way, right? So you might not really have to know something unless you care about it or something like that. It gives you no reason to believe. There might be very epistemic facts that would suggest that you ought to believe something, but if you didn't care about that, we wouldn't.
I would still say you are. I mean, if somebody says, I believe in astrology, and I go, well, that's just wrong, there's not good evidence. They go, I don't care. I don't even care whether it's true. I just believe it. I'm going to go, well, you shouldn't.
So you might then be debating about what's the true domain of morality then, right? So some people might take epistemology, the epistemic or claim to be in that, and some people might not.
To be in the realm of morality?
Right, that's right.
Seems to me if people believe that, it supports my thesis that the line between moral and not moral is in trouble.
Okay, I'm going to turn the microphone over to Matthew Lau. While I'm doing that, let's